The Phoenix Ascent. Episode 3, Milton Hershey. The man who failed his way to sweet success. Welcome back to The Phoenix Ascent, the podcast that proves success isn't about luck. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most delicious stories of failure and triumph in American business history. What if I told you that the man behind America's most beloved chocolate company failed not once, not twice, but 3 times before finding sweet success? What if I told you that Milton Hershey went bankrupt, lost everything, and was written off as a failure by the age of 30? What if I told you that he turned those failures into the foundation of a $20 billion empire and one of the most generous, philanthropic legacies in American history? Today, we're exploring the extraordinary journey of Milton Snavely Hershey, a man who turned bitter failure into the sweetest success story in American confectionery history. This is a tale of persistence that would make Job weep, innovation that changed an entire industry, and the unshakable belief that failure is not the end of the story, but the beginning of wisdom. From a one-room schoolhouse in rural Pennsylvania to the boardrooms of industrial America, from bankruptcy court to philanthropic glory, Milton Hershey's story will challenge everything you think you know about success, failure, and the price of dreams. Here is your podcast intro. Success isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time. Welcome to the Phoenix Ascent, the podcast that proves success is never about luck. I'm your host, and this is where we explore the most incredible comeback stories in business history. But these aren't ordinary comebacks. Every entrepreneur we feature has done something extraordinary. They've gone from rags to riches, lost everything, then built it back even bigger to prove their success wasn't a fluke. These are the stories of people who rose from nothing, achieved incredible wealth, watched it all disappear, and then did the impossible. They started over. They rebuilt. They proved that true champions aren't defined by their circumstances, but by their refusal to accept defeat. If you've ever faced failure and wondered if you could come back stronger, if you've ever questioned whether success is about luck or skill, then you're about to discover something powerful. The phoenix doesn't rise in spite of the ashes. It rises because of them. This is the Phoenix Ascent. Let's rise together. Chapter 1. The Farm Boy's Dream, Seeds of Ambition in Pennsylvania Soil. Our story begins on September 13th, 1857, in the rolling hills of Derry Township, Pennsylvania, where the morning mist clings to cornfields and the pace of life is measured not in minutes, but in seasons. Milton Snavely Hershey was born into a world of simple pleasures and hard work, a Mennonite farming community where success was measured not in dollars, but in the quality of your character and the sweat of your brow. The Pennsylvania of Milton's childhood was a land of contradictions. It was rural and traditional, yet it sat at the heart of America's emerging industrial revolution. Philadelphia was just hours away by train, bringing news of fortunes made and lost, of immigrants chasing the American dream, of a nation transforming itself from agricultural to industrial at breathtaking speed. Milton's father, Henry Hershey, embodied these contradictions perfectly. He was a Mennonite farmer by birth, but a dreamer by nature, always chasing the next big opportunity, always convinced that fortune was just around the corner. Henry would disappear for weeks at a time, pursuing get-rich-quick schemes that range from oil speculation to patent medicine sales. He was a man perpetually convinced that his ship was about to come in, even as his family struggled to make ends meet. Milton's mother, Veronica Buckwalter Hershey, was the anchor that kept the family from drifting away on Henry's dreams. She was practical where he was fanciful, hard-working where he was distracted, and determined to keep the family grounded when Henry's schemes threatened to carry them away. Veronica understood that dreams without discipline are just fantasies, and she was determined that her son would learn the difference. Young Milton inherited both traits: his father's restless ambition and his mother's unwavering determination. But he also inherited something else, a sweet tooth that would change the course of American confectionery history. Even as a child, Milton was fascinated by candy. He would save his pennies to buy peppermint sticks from the local general store, studying how they were made, wondering if he could make them better. The Hershey household was not wealthy, but it was rich in values that would serve Milton well in the trials ahead. Veronica taught him that honest work was its own reward, that failure was not a character flaw, but a learning opportunity, and that persistence could overcome almost any obstacle. These lessons would be tested sooner than anyone expected. In 1871, when Milton was just 14 years old, his formal education came to an abrupt end. Henry Hershey, convinced that his son needed practical skills more than book learning, pulled Milton out of the one-room schoolhouse where he had been a mediocre student at best. The boy who would one day build a chocolate empire had completed only 4 years of formal education. Henry arranged for Milton to apprentice with Sam Ernst, who published a German-language newspaper called The Patriot in nearby Lancaster. The printing business was supposed to teach Milton discipline, provide him with a stable trade, and set him on the path to middle-class respectability. Instead, it taught him his first lesson about failure and about following your passion even when others don't understand it. Milton was a disaster as a printer's apprentice. He was more interested in the candy shop next door than the newspaper office. He would sneak away during lunch breaks to watch the confectioner work, mesmerized by the transformation of simple sugar into complex sweets. His mind wandered during work, his hands were clumsy with the type, and his heart simply wasn't in the business of making newspapers. After just a few months, Sam Ernst had had enough. He fired the 14-year-old Milton, complaining to Henry Hershey that the boy was more interested in making candy than making newspapers. It was Milton's first professional failure, but it was also his first glimpse of his true calling. Most parents would have been mortified by their son's failure. Henry Hershey was merely frustrated. This wasn't part of his plan for Milton's future. But Veronica saw something different in her son's failure. She saw passion, she saw interest, and she saw potential. And she knew exactly what to do about it. Veronica's sister, Mattie Snavely, lived in Lancaster and had connections in the confectionery business. She arranged for Milton to apprentice with Joseph Royer, a Swiss-German confectioner who ran one of Lancaster's most respected candy shops. For the first time in his young life, Milton Hershey was about to discover what it felt like to love your work. Joseph Royer's shop was a wonderland for a boy with Milton's interests. The air was thick with the scent of vanilla and chocolate. The counters were lined with glass jars filled with colorful confections, and the back room was a laboratory where simple ingredients were transformed into edible magic. Milton had found his calling. For 4 years, from 1872 to 1876, Milton learned the art and science of candy making. He studied the precise temperatures needed for perfect caramel. Too cool and it wouldn't set, too hot and it would burn. He learned the delicate balance of sugar and cream that created smooth, rich textures. He mastered the timing that turned simple ingredients into complex flavors. But Milton learned more than just techniques. He learned about customer service, about quality control, about the importance of consistency in both product and business practices. Joseph Royer was a master craftsman, but he was also a successful businessman. And he taught Milton that the two skills were inseparable. By 1876, Milton had absorbed everything Joseph Royer could teach him. At 19 years old, he was a skilled confectioner with 4 years of experience and an unshakable belief in his abilities. He was ready to strike out on his own, to build his own business, to chase his own version of the American dream. With $600 borrowed from his aunt and uncle, a substantial sum in 1876, Milton was ready to open his first candy shop. He chose Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, America's birthplace, and one of the largest markets on the East Coast. He was young, ambitious, skilled, and absolutely certain that success was within his grasp. Milton had no idea that he was about to begin a decade of failure that would test every ounce of his determination, challenge every assumption about success, and teach him lessons that no apprenticeship could provide. He was about to discover that knowing how to make candy and knowing how to run a candy business were two entirely different skills. Chapter 2. The First Fall. Philadelphia Dreams Turn Bitter. Philadelphia in 1876 was a city drunk on its own success. The Centennial Exhibition was drawing visitors from around the world, showcasing American ingenuity and industrial might. The city was growing rapidly, immigrants were pouring in seeking opportunity, and young entrepreneurs like Milton Hershey believed they could capture their share of the American dream. Milton's candy shop was located on Spring Garden Street in the heart of Philadelphia's commercial district. It was small but ambitious, just a narrow storefront with a few display cases in a back room where Milton made his confections. But to 19-year-old Milton Hershey, it represented everything he had worked for and dreamed of. Milton's approach was simple but labor-intensive. He made fresh candy daily using the techniques Joseph Royer had taught him. His caramels were rich and creamy, his hard candies were perfectly clear, and his chocolate work was as good as anything being produced in America at the time. The quality was exceptional, but quality alone wasn't enough to guarantee success. For 6 years, Milton poured his heart and soul into that little shop. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. He was the candy maker, the shopkeeper, the bookkeeper, and the janitor. He perfected his recipes, served customers with genuine enthusiasm, and managed every aspect of the business with the dedication of a man whose entire future depended on its success. But passion and hard work, Milton was learning, weren't enough to overcome the harsh realities of business competition. Philadelphia's confectionery market was brutal. Established companies had deep pockets, loyal customers, and distribution networks that Milton could only dream of. They could afford to sell at lower prices, advertise more aggressively, and weather temporary losses that would destroy a small operation like Milton's. Milton had learned to make excellent candy, but he had never learned to run a business. He struggled with cash flow, the eternal challenge of small businesses where money goes out faster than it comes in. He had trouble managing inventory, often running out of popular items while being stuck with slow-moving stock. He found it difficult to balance quality with profitability, often spending more on ingredients than his prices could support. The competition was relentless and sophisticated. Large confectionery companies were beginning to use industrial methods, producing candy in quantities that Milton couldn't match and at prices he couldn't compete with. They had salesmen calling on retailers, advertising budgets that dwarfed Milton's entire revenue, and the financial resources to expand into new markets. Milton's location, which had seemed perfect in 1876, was becoming a liability by the early 1880s. Rent was expensive, foot traffic was declining as the city's commercial center shifted, and newer, larger competitors were opening shops in better locations. Milton was trapped between rising costs and falling revenues, with no clear path to profitability. By 1881, Milton could no longer deny the mathematics of failure. His expenses consistently exceeded his income. His debts were mounting faster than his ability to pay them, and his credit with suppliers was exhausted. The dream that had sustained him for 6 years was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The end came swiftly and brutally. Creditors began demanding immediate payment. Suppliers refused to extend further credit, and the landlord threatened eviction. Milton had poured everything into the business: his money, his time, his energy, his dreams, and it still wasn't enough. In 1882, at the age of 25, Milton Hershey was forced to close his shop and declare bankruptcy. The young man who had been so confident just 6 years earlier was now a failed businessman with ruined credit and shattered dreams. Everything he had worked for was gone. Most people would have given up at this point. Most people would have returned to the farm, accepted a job working for someone else, and abandoned their entrepreneurial dreams. The conventional wisdom would have been to play it safe, to avoid the risks that had led to such spectacular failure. But Milton Hershey was not most people. As he packed his few remaining belongings and prepared to leave Philadelphia, he wasn't thinking about giving up. He was thinking about what he had learned. The failure had been painful, but it had also been educational. He now understood things about business that no textbook could have taught him. Milton had learned about cash flow management the hard way. He had learned about competition, about market positioning, about the importance of location and pricing. He had learned that good products weren't enough without good business practices. Most importantly, He had learned that failure wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of one chapter. Milton packed his belongings and headed west to Denver, Colorado, where his father Henry was pursuing yet another get-rich-quick scheme. Milton wasn't going to join his father's latest venture. He was going to regroup, learn more about his craft, and prepare for his next attempt at entrepreneurial success. The young man who boarded that westbound train was different from the confident 19-year-old who had opened his first shop. He was older, wiser, and more realistic about the challenges ahead. But he was also more determined than ever to succeed. Philadelphia had been his first failure, but it wouldn't be his last attempt. Chapter 3: Learning in the West, Denver's Sweet Lessons. Denver in 1882 was a city caught between its rough frontier past and its ambitious industrial future. The silver boom was in full swing. Fortunes were being made and lost daily, and the city was filled with dreamers, schemers, and hard workers, all chasing their version of prosperity. Milton arrived in Denver with nothing but his skills and his determination to learn from his Philadelphia failure. He had no money to start another business, no credit to secure loans, and no choice but to work for someone else while he figured out his next move. He found work with a local confectioner who specialized in caramels and hard candies. The pay was modest, but Milton wasn't there for the money. He was there for the education. He wanted to learn everything he could about different approaches to candy making, different business models, and different ways to succeed in the confectionery trade. It was in Denver that Milton learned a technique that would change everything. How to make caramel using fresh milk instead of paraffin. Most candy makers of the era used paraffin wax to give their caramels the proper texture and shelf life. It was cheaper, more reliable, and easier to work with than milk. But Milton's employer had discovered that fresh milk, when handled properly, created caramels that were creamier, more flavorful, and longer lasting than anything made with paraffin. The technique was more difficult and more expensive, but the results were dramatically superior. Milton absorbed this knowledge like a sponge. He practiced the technique until he could execute it perfectly, experimented with different ratios and temperatures, and began to envision how this innovation could give him a competitive advantage in his next business venture. But Milton learned more than just candy-making techniques in Denver. He learned about the importance of innovation, about finding ways to differentiate your product from the competition. He learned that sometimes the more expensive approach was actually the more profitable one if it created enough additional value for customers. After 2 years in Denver, Milton felt ready to try again. He had new skills, new knowledge, and a new appreciation for the complexities of running a successful business. But this time, he wasn't going to start small in a secondary market. He was heading to the biggest, most competitive market in America, New York City. Milton's decision to tackle New York City showed both his ambition and his naivety. He believed that his superior product, caramels made with fresh milk, would be enough to overcome the brutal competition of the nation's largest market. He was about to learn that superior products still needed superior business execution to succeed. Chapter 4, The Second Fall. New York City crushes dreams. New York City in the 1880s was the ultimate test for any entrepreneur. It was a city of 8 million people, endless opportunity, and ruthless competition. Fortunes were made and lost daily, dreams were crushed as often as they were fulfilled, and only the strongest, smartest, and luckiest survived. Milton Hershey arrived in New York with his secret weapon, the fresh milk caramel technique he had learned in Denver, and the unshakable belief that this time would be different. He rented a small shop, invested his limited savings in equipment and ingredients, and began making the finest caramels New York had ever tasted. The product was indeed superior to anything else on the market. Milton's milk caramels were creamier, more flavorful, and had a texture that customers found irresistible. Word began to spread about the young confectioner who was making extraordinary candy in his small shop. But superior product quality, Milton was about to learn, wasn't enough to overcome superior competition. New York's established confectioners had advantages that went far beyond the quality of their candy. They had deep pockets that could weather temporary losses, established relationships with retailers and distributors, and decades of experience in the brutal art of commercial warfare. Milton was David facing not one Goliath, but an entire army of them. His competitors could afford to sell at prices that barely covered Milton's cost of ingredients. They had sales forces that could call on every retailer in the city, while Milton was limited to customers who happened to walk into his shop. They had advertising budgets that dwarfed Milton's entire revenue. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and unforgiving. Milton's rent was higher than his total revenue had been in Philadelphia. His ingredient costs were higher because he insisted on using fresh milk and premium materials. His labor costs were higher because New York wages exceeded those in smaller markets. And his sales were limited because he couldn't compete with the marketing and distribution power of his established competitors. Milton tried everything he could think of to make the business work. He extended his hours, working from dawn until midnight 7 days a week. He cut his own salary to nothing, living on bread and water to keep costs down. He tried to expand his product line, adding new varieties of candy to attract more customers. But nothing worked. The fundamental economics of the situation were against him. He was a small, undercapitalized business trying to compete with large, well-funded companies in the most competitive market in America. It was like trying to stop a freight train with your bare hands. For 3 years, Milton fought the inevitable. He borrowed money from anyone who would lend it, delayed payments to suppliers as long as possible, and sacrificed everything personal for the slim hope that the business might somehow turn around. But by 1886, even Milton's legendary persistence couldn't overcome the harsh realities of business failure. His debts exceeded his assets by a substantial margin. His credit was completely exhausted, and his suppliers were refusing to extend any further terms. The end was inevitable and approaching fast. The collapse, when it came, was swift and total. Creditors seized his equipment, landlords evicted him from his shop, and suppliers demanded immediate payment for outstanding debts. Milton found himself not just broke, but deeply in debt, with ruined credit and a reputation as a two-time business failure. At 29 years old, Milton Hershey had failed twice in spectacular fashion. He was deeper in debt than ever. His credit was completely destroyed, and his reputation in business circles was toxic. Most people would have declared bankruptcy, accepted defeat, and spent the rest of their lives working for someone else. But as Milton stood in the ruins of his second failed business, something interesting was happening in his mind. Instead of despair, he was feeling something unexpected: clarity. The failures had been painful, but they had also been educational. He was beginning to understand patterns, to see connections, to recognize the lessons that only failure can teach. Milton realized that his failures hadn't been random bad luck. They had been the result of specific, identifiable mistakes. In Philadelphia, he had underestimated the importance of business skills versus product skills. In New York, he had underestimated the power of established competition and the importance of adequate capitalization. These weren't character flaws or permanent limitations. They were knowledge gaps that could be filled. Milton was beginning to understand that failure wasn't the opposite of success. It was the raw material from which success could be built, if you were willing to learn from it. Milton made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided to go home, not to surrender, but to regroup. He would return to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he understood the market, where he had connections, and where he could apply everything he had learned from two spectacular failures. The man who boarded the train back to Pennsylvania was fundamentally different from the confident young entrepreneur who had left 6 years earlier. He was older, wiser, and more realistic about the challenges of business. But he was also more determined than ever to succeed, because now he understood what success actually required. Chapter 5, The Third Time's the Charm, Lancaster Caramel Company. Lancaster in 1886 was a far cry from the bustling metropolises where Milton had tried and failed. It was a smaller market, a simpler environment, and exactly what Milton needed to rebuild his shattered dreams. But more importantly, it was a place where Milton understood the customers, the competition, and the business environment. But starting over wasn't going to be easy. Milton's credit was destroyed, his reputation was in ruins, and potential investors saw him as a two-time failure. When he approached local banks for funding, they laughed him out of their offices. Who would invest in a man who had failed twice in spectacular fashion? Milton's family situation was complicated as well. His father, Henry, was off pursuing another get-rich-quick scheme, leaving Milton and his mother, Veronica, to fend for themselves. Veronica believed in her son's abilities, but she had no money to invest in his dreams. Milton was on his own, with nothing but his knowledge, his determination, and his hard-earned wisdom. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. William Lebkicker, a cashier at the Lancaster National Bank. Lebkicker had been watching Milton's struggles from afar, but he had also been paying attention to Milton's abilities. More importantly, he had tasted Milton's milk caramels during one of Milton's earlier visits to Lancaster. Lebkicker understood something that the other bankers had missed. Milton's failures hadn't been due to lack of skill or poor products, but to inexperience and undercapitalization. The young man had learned from his mistakes, and his product quality was exceptional. Lebkicker was willing to bet on the man behind the product. With Lebkicker's backing and a small loan, Milton founded the Lancaster Caramel Company in 1886. But this time, he approached business completely differently. He had learned from his failures in Philadelphia and New York, and he was determined not to repeat those mistakes. Milton started small and focused. Instead of trying to compete with everyone, he concentrated on making the best milk caramels possible and building a loyal local customer base. Instead of expanding rapidly, he grew slowly and sustainably, reinvesting profits back into the business rather than taking on debt. The Lancaster Caramel Company began with just Milton and a few employees in a small factory building. Milton handled the candy making personally, ensuring that every batch met his exacting standards. He used only the finest ingredients: fresh milk from local farms, pure cane sugar, and real vanilla, regardless of the cost. But Milton had learned that great products needed great business practices to succeed. He implemented careful cost accounting, tracking every penny of expenses and revenue. He managed cash flow meticulously, never extending credit beyond his ability to collect. He built relationships with suppliers based on mutual respect and prompt payment. The results were immediate and encouraging. Local stores began carrying Milton's caramels, and customers responded enthusiastically. The superior quality was obvious to anyone who tasted them, and word-of-mouth recommendations began driving sales growth. Within a year, Milton was employing a dozen people and shipping caramels throughout Pennsylvania. Within 2 years, he was receiving orders from New York, Philadelphia, and other major markets. The business that had started as a desperate attempt at redemption was becoming a genuine success. By 1890, just 4 years after his third start, Milton Hershey was employing over 100 people. The Lancaster Caramel Company was shipping candy across the United States and even internationally. Milton had finally achieved the success that had eluded him for so long. But this time it was built on a foundation of hard-earned wisdom rather than naive optimism. The success was sweet in more ways than one. Milton was finally able to pay back his debts from his previous failures, restore his credit, and provide financial security for his mother. He had proven that his earlier failures weren't due to lack of ability, but to lack of experience. But Milton Hershey was about to make a decision that would shock the business world and set the stage for his greatest triumph. At the height of his caramel success, when the Lancaster Caramel Company was generating substantial profits and seemed positioned for continued growth, Milton was going to risk everything on a completely new venture. In 1893, Milton attended the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where he encountered German chocolate-making equipment that would change his life forever. He was fascinated by the chocolate-making process, intrigued by the possibilities, and convinced that chocolate represented the future of confectionery. Milton purchased the German equipment and began experimenting with chocolate production in a corner of his caramel factory. But this wasn't just a hobby or a side business. Milton was preparing to bet everything on chocolate. He was convinced that he could do for chocolate what he had done for caramels, make it better, more affordable, and more accessible to ordinary Americans. For 7 years, Milton experimented with chocolate while continuing to run his successful caramel business. He studied European chocolate-making techniques, experimented with different formulations, and gradually developed his own approach to creating superior chocolate products. And then, in 1900, Milton made a decision that stunned everyone who knew him. He sold the Lancaster Caramel Company, his successful, profitable, established business, for $1 million. He was going to use that money to build a chocolate factory and chase a dream that most people thought was impossible. Milton's friends thought he was crazy. His business associates thought he was throwing away a sure thing for a risky gamble. Even his mother worried that he was repeating the pattern of his father, chasing dreams instead of appreciating success. But Milton had learned something from his failures that his critics hadn't. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all. He believed that chocolate was the future, and he was willing to bet everything on that belief. Chapter 6. The Chocolate Gamble: Building an Empire from Cocoa Beans. In 1900, chocolate was a luxury product in America, imported from Europe and available only to the wealthy. Most American chocolate was dark, bitter, and expensive. Nothing like the sweet, creamy product we know today. Milton Hershey was about to change all of that. But first he had to solve problems that had stumped confectioners for decades. Milton's vision was revolutionary for its time. He wanted to create affordable milk chocolate for the masses. He wanted to democratize chocolate, to make it accessible to every American family, to transform it from a luxury item into an everyday pleasure. But the technical challenges were enormous. Making milk chocolate was incredibly difficult. Milk contains water, and water makes chocolate seize up and become grainy. European chocolatiers had developed complex processes using powdered milk, but Milton wanted to use fresh milk from local Pennsylvania farms. He believed that fresh milk would create a superior product, but no one had ever figured out how to make it work reliably. For months, Milton experimented in his new chocolate factory. He tried different temperatures, different mixing techniques, different ratios of milk to chocolate. Batch after batch failed. The chocolate curdled, spoiled, or turned grainy. His workers began to wonder if their boss had lost his mind. Milton's competitors were watching his struggles with amusement and anticipation. Many expected him to fail spectacularly, just as he had in Philadelphia and New York. The difference was that this time, Milton had the financial resources to sustain a long period of experimentation, and the hard-earned wisdom to persist through temporary failures. The breakthrough came after hundreds of failed attempts. Milton discovered that the key was not just the temperature or the mixing technique, but the precise timing of when the milk was added to the chocolate. It had to be done at exactly the right moment, under exactly the right conditions, with exactly the right equipment. Milton had cracked the code. He had developed a process for making smooth, creamy milk chocolate using fresh milk from local farms. The exact formula remained a closely guarded secret, but the result was unmistakable. The most delicious chocolate Americans had ever tasted. But Milton's ambitions went far beyond just making good chocolate. In 1903, he broke ground on a massive chocolate factory in Derry Township, Pennsylvania, near his childhood home. This wasn't just going to be a factory, it was going to be the foundation of an entire community. Milton was building a company town, complete with homes for workers, schools for their children, recreational facilities, and all the amenities of modern life. He believed that happy, well-cared-for workers would produce better chocolate, and that a thriving community would attract the best employees. The Hershey Chocolate Company was an immediate success. Milton's milk chocolate bars, priced at just 5 cents each, were affordable enough for ordinary families, but delicious enough to compete with expensive imported chocolates. Sales exploded as Americans discovered the joy of accessible, high-quality chocolate. In 1907, Milton introduced Hershey's Kisses, the distinctive cone-shaped chocolates that would become one of America's most beloved candies. The production process was innovative. Each kiss was individually wrapped by hand by teams of women workers, creating both a superior product and hundreds of jobs. By 1910, Milton was producing millions of chocolate bars annually and employing thousands of workers. The town of Hershey, Pennsylvania had grown from farmland into a thriving industrial community. Milton had not only succeeded, he had created an entirely new industry and transformed the lives of thousands of people. But Milton's greatest test was still ahead. In 1915, his beloved wife, Catherine, died after a long illness, leaving Milton devastated and alone. Many expected him to retreat from business, to sell his company and live quietly on his wealth. Instead, Milton channeled his grief into generosity. He and Catherine had never had children of their own, but they had always planned to use their wealth to help others. In 1909, they had established the Hershey Industrial School for orphan boys. And now Milton decided to give it everything. In 1918, Milton donated his entire fortune, worth hundreds of millions in today's dollars, to the school that would eventually become the Milton Hershey School. He kept only enough money to live comfortably, giving away one of the largest fortunes in American history. Milton continued to run the Hershey Company until his death in 1945. But he did so as an employee of the school he had endowed. He had transformed himself from a failed entrepreneur into one of America's greatest philanthropists, proving that success isn't just about making money, it's about what you do with it. Chapter 7, The Phoenix Ascent, Lessons from Sweet Success. Milton Hershey died on October 13, 1945, at the age of 88. He had lived long enough to see his chocolate company become a global empire, his town become a thriving community, and his school become a beacon of hope for thousands of children. But perhaps most importantly, he had lived long enough to prove that failure is not the opposite of success. It's the foundation upon which success is built. Today, the Hershey Company is worth over $20 billion and employs more than 15,000 people worldwide. The Milton Hershey School has educated over 10,000 students and continues to provide opportunities for children in need. The town of Hershey, Pennsylvania, remains a thriving community built on the foundation of one man's vision and persistence. But Milton Hershey's greatest legacy isn't his chocolate empire or his philanthropic foundation. It's his example. He showed us that failure is not a verdict on your character, but a lesson in your education. He proved that persistence, learning, and character matter more than luck, connections, or natural talent. Milton's story teaches us that success is not a destination you reach, but a process you follow. It's not about avoiding failure, but about learning from it. It's not about being perfect, but about being persistent. It's not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions. His first failure in Philadelphia taught him that passion without business skills is not enough. His second failure in New York taught him that good products without adequate resources and market understanding are not enough. His third attempt in Lancaster succeeded because he had learned from both previous failures and applied those lessons systematically. But Milton's story also teaches us about the importance of innovation and risk-taking. When he sold his successful caramel company to pursue chocolate, he was risking everything on an unproven concept. He could have played it safe, continued making caramels, and lived comfortably on his success. Instead, He chose to bet everything on his vision of the future. Milton understood something that many successful people forget. Risk is often not taking any risks at all. He saw that chocolate was the future of confectionery, and he was willing to sacrifice his present success for his future vision. Perhaps most importantly, Milton's story teaches us about the relationship between success and generosity. He didn't accumulate wealth for its own sake, but as a tool for creating opportunity for others. His greatest satisfaction came not from his business success, but from the children who received education and opportunity through his generosity. Milton Hershey's phoenix didn't just rise from the ashes of his failures. It soared to heights that transformed an entire industry and touched thousands of lives. His story proves that the phoenix isn't just a mythical bird. It's a metaphor for the human capacity to transform failure into success, setbacks into comebacks, and personal achievement into lasting legacy. In a world that celebrates overnight success and fears public failure, Milton Hershey stands as a beacon of hope for everyone who has ever lost everything and wondered if they could build it back. His answer is clear. Not only can you build it back, but you can build it better than before if you're willing to learn from your failures and persist through your challenges. Every time you unwrap a Hershey's chocolate bar, you're holding a piece of Milton Hershey's Phoenix Ascent. Every time you see the Milton Hershey School providing opportunities for children in need, you're witnessing the ongoing legacy of a man who turned bitter failure into sweet success. Milton Hershey's story reminds us that the sweetest success often comes after the bitterest failure. He failed 3 times before creating one of America's most beloved companies, proving that persistence and learning from failure are more valuable than avoiding it altogether. His journey from bankruptcy to billionaire philanthropist shows us that failure is not a character flaw, it's a learning opportunity. Every setback taught him something essential about business, about innovation, about the importance of timing and preparation and persistence. But perhaps Milton's greatest lesson is about the purpose of success itself. He didn't accumulate wealth to hoard it, but to share it. He understood that true success is measured not by what you achieve for yourself, but by what you create for others. If you're facing your own failures right now, if you're wondering whether you have what it takes to try again, remember Milton's journey. Remember that every great success story is built on a foundation of failures, setbacks, and lessons learned the hard way. Your failures don't define you, they prepare you. The chocolate empire that Milton built from the ashes of his failures continues to bring joy to millions of people around the world. The school he endowed continues to provide opportunities for children who need them most. His phoenix continues to soar decades after his death because he understood that true success creates value that outlasts the person who created it. Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Phoenix Ascent. If Milton's story inspired you, please share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our podcast for more stories of entrepreneurs who proved that success isn't about luck. It's about the courage to rise again after falling. Until next time, remember, every failure is a lesson, Every setback is a setup for a comeback, and every phoenix rises stronger than before. The sweetest success is always built on the foundation of the bitterest failure. You've just heard another story of failure, grit, and the rise that followed. Because here at the Phoenix Ascent, we don't just admire success, we dissect the fall that made it possible. Remember, every setback is a setup, every loss a lesson, and every flameout a chance to rise again. So if you're facing your own ashes, remember, you're not alone. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. While you are at it, if you like the show, leave us a 5-star review. That really helps spread the word. Join our mailing list if you want to be notified when the next story is ready for you. This has been the Phoenix Ascent. Until next time, keep rising.